friends, to our monthly no due date virtual salon. I'm Amy Willis with Liberty Fund, and it is my distinct pleasure to welcome all of you today to a conversation with two fascinating friends, Pete Boettke, our intrepid host, and Amity Shlaes, the author of this month's selection, The Great Society. As you know, we will allow Pete and Amity to have a bit of a conversation, and then we'll open it up to all of you for questions and engagement. So please just use your raise hand function or signal excitedly to me in the background, and we'll make sure to get your questions in. The recording will, of course, be available in our online portal space for those who couldn't make it, and for those of you who'd like to watch again, certainly by next week. So thank you all for taking time out of your day to join us. Thank you, Pete, for a fascinating selection for this month. And thank you especially, Amity, for joining us and being willing to engage in conversation with us today. Pete, I turn it to you.
Okay, great. I'm very fortunate today to have Amity Shlaes, who's a New York Times bestselling author and also currently the chair of the Board of Trustees of the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation. So anyway, Amity, thank you for doing this. I usually start these conversations with an origin story question, which is, in your case, you graduated from Yale with a degree in English. How is it that a person who has a degree in English ends up by becoming a journalist and historian of taxation, ultimately of politics and economic policy more generally?
Well, Pete, we all make mistakes. In my case, undergraduates play to their comparative advantage, and if they're a basketball player, they play basketball at the time. But my comparative advantage at that time was language, and college funnels you into your area, if only because of the pleasure of it, but also because you want to get a good record to go to graduate school. So I kind of stayed away from courses where I might get a B-. And I wasn't bad at math, but I wasn't great at it. And econ presented as math, which is one of its problems, of course. I think also, I grew up, basically I wanted to explore political economy. And I grew up in that environment in Chicago and also at Yale. There's also, the differentiation factor. Everyone in my family is an expert in the nature of value. They're appraisers. My father, my grandfather, my brother. So one wants to do something different, and that's a feature too. But I did go to graduate school in economics because I worked in communist countries, and there's no better way to learn what works and what doesn't when it comes to economics than to spend time in a communist country. It's you figure out why the money doesn't work and so on. That ended up being my graduate school, not informal but useful. And also, of course, I was on the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal and worked there almost 2 decades and wrote, and the core business of the journal is economics. So my doctor father, so to speak, was Bob Bartley, the editor of the journal at that time.
Let me get to the Great Society, which I unashamedly will say I think is a great book, which is one of the things that is in the book is that you have characters that come to life, all these different players, actually. And one of the things I found really refreshing was that you actually present them always in a kind of, from their point of view, a good light, as opposed to going out of your way to try to present them in a bad light, which tends to be the way that a lot of histories are being written at the moment about people. But you give them the respect of their own self-understanding of what they were doing, and the sort of way in which they are pursuing their projects. And these characters like Sergeant Shriver, Michael Harrington, Tom Hayden, it's Walter Reuther,
yeah.
Arthur Burns, and I would say especially Daniel Patrick Moynihan. So as you were researching and writing this, what happened with your appreciation of these characters? Did they grow, wane? and why?
The one who stuck with me, it's a hard name. It's Walter Reuther, Reuther. And the reason we know him is he was on the news every night in the 1960s. So it would go like this. There were so and so many casualties in Vietnam and Doc Peck and what all. And then they would say, and Walter Reuther said. Walter Reuther was the head of the United Auto Workers, a key labor union at a time when later labor unions mattered much more, and the auto industry mattered much more to the U.S. economy than it does now. And in addition, Reuther, I was in the Midwest, right? And the auto industry was in the Midwest. And I remembered this, but until I did the research for this book, I didn't realize the extent of the influence of labor unions on the progress of American politics in the 60s. And what do I mean by that? I'll give you an example. There was a very storied student meeting which produced something called the Port Huron Statement, a manifesto, where students went to a nice place by Lake Huron and wrote a kind of airy, studentish, utopian description of their goals. And it was all poetic, and it was youth speaking to power. This was in the early 60s. And that group is important. Partly Tom Hayden, the radical activist, was there as a young man. That group was important. They later became Students for a Democratic Society. Some of them went anarchist and violent, and they spun out and hurt the Democratic Party in the sense that in 68, they made the left look so bad that Richard Nixon won, long story short. But what I didn't realize when I went to write this book was that famous Port Huron meeting, I think, it's mentioned in culture, was funded by the UAW. It wasn't some spontaneous student speech to power. It was a propagandistic effort by the UAW. Why? The UAW became conscious that a lot of young Americans were now going to college. Maybe it wanted a college wing. Maybe it wanted to steer the American youth movement. So it set this little group up with a place to stay, like a rural, nice beachside set of cabins, and also employed some of them, including Hayden. That was shocking to me. It was also shocking to me the extent to which Reuther was involved with Martin Luther King. It was actually the UAW that funded the bailing out of MLK from the Birmingham jail. I mean, the dollars went down in someone's suit. I had no knowledge of this, none, or no awareness really until I looked into the period. And the union made an error because, the groups it supported, not so much MLK, but the student radical groups turned against it. Instead of broadening their power base, their group, their umbrella, they created divisions because the students turned against the old union fathers. So I didn't know that. That was just not part of the story for me.
Yeah, I think that readers, and I hope everyone did this, is take a few minutes to make sure you look through the appendix and the different charts that are in there, because one of the things that's really striking is on 439 is the decline in union membership that takes place during this, not after this period of time, say up to 2000. And right now, what you're seeing is also an effort to try to now make that reverse, right? And so this leads to my next question in a little bit, which is, and this will reflect my own biases. So I was somewhat appalled at the what I'll call the tacit presuppositions of political economy that many of the architects of the Great Society programs operated from. The simple way to put it is they just believed in big government. And government was a solution to all their problems. Government is a corrective. And I knew, from studying economics, that, this period of time, the post-World War II, 1950s, 1960s, was kind of a low watermark for free market economics. But I didn't realize how low it was. So that even, a figure like Milton Friedman, let alone people like Hayek and Mises, are just so far out of step of what the zeitgeist was. And so that had, reading your book, this is again myopic to me, but reading your book increased my appreciation of Milton Friedman and others like him for the courage that they had, intellectual courage to stand and as Buchanan used to say to us, I was a student of Jim Buchanan, and he used to say that it's not the courage of your convictions, but the courage to withstand the critique of your convictions. And of course, I became an economist after Free to Choose. So at some level, the terms of the debate were always on my side of the debate, meaning that people that wanted big government were the ones that had to prove, not ones who believe in free market. But at this time, the terms of the debate are completely opposite of that. And the second thing is how, in my sense, how eerily similar our current intellectual culture is to the one that you describe in the Great Society idea. And so one of the questions that I wanted to ask you, which is outside the book, is how did that happen? We learned the lesson of the Great Society in the stagflation of the 70s, right? And the failure in the 70s of, the economies that are overregulated and whatnot. And therefore Milton Friedman wins the day, and, the sort of arguments come in, and then we have globalization and other kinds of, more the Washington consensus, let's say, and we experience these growth rates and, post-communism, as you mentioned, and whatnot. But yet now we're back to a world where I could easily imagine a policy analyst in government ending their, a internal memo by saying, we will never fix this problem unless we abolish capitalism.
Right.
And so we've made full circle. So we're all the way back to Michael Harrington, to attitudes, 40 years later, more than 40 years. What is it? 60 to now, so it'd be 40 years, 60 years later, right? We're all the way full circle. How did that come about?
Well, the epigram in the book is nothing is new, it's just forgotten, right?
Yeah.
So our current experience, we think we're trying a new experiment, but the experiment has been tried, and it failed. But most young people basically never learned that, and part of the problem is just they're younger. They weren't there for the war. They weren't there for the 70s, but also our failure in terms of education. And one thing that I wish I'd had more of in the book is what happened to education, because there was indeed a long march through education through the educational establishment by professors who started out in the 60s, and then curricula changed. So young people don't learn and square economics, what happened in the 70s, a lot of those things, and the balkanization of education without any common core. We all go off into our discipline. So those two things. I wish I'd spent more time on NPR, because NPR is the teacher's Bible, right? The teacher's preacher. Every morning, school teachers get up and they listen to public radio for 50 years. Well, so NPR teaches gives one vision of America, and it's not entirely balanced. So I think the creation of NPR, which was culturally a Great Society thing, but also was aided by President Nixon, we underrated the effect of that in terms of what people think is normal. Regular, so that to the point where one can't even have a conversation, because the ideas one has about markets, the counterparty has never heard those ideas. And that's disconcerting. So I think public radio, funding on education, public sector unions, all those things that were reinforced in the Great Society period, they had more effect than we imagined.
Yeah, I'm actually very intrigued by what you just said about NPR, because I hadn't thought about that either. There's a great history of The Economist magazine where the historian goes through the various different ways in which The Economist argued for basically following out of, Bagehot's original idea, whatever, right? And how liberalism then evolves based on the economists' depictions of liberalism. It would be fascinating to go through NPR transcripts and see the way in which markets are presented in NPR.
That would be a great couple dissertations for all of us. It's not always conscious. But I was, and there's been an abdication on the right or on the free market side or both, which is to say, you alluded to it earlier, Pete. Fox, as interesting as it is all about anger. There's not much inquiry and contemplation, and the brain that prefers inquiry, discussion, and contemplation steps back from that, as you don't want to be exhorted and to demonstrate unreflected patriotism. You want to think about whether you actually feel patriotic and why, and in what area. So we have had no serious counterweight or insufficient counterweight to the seriousness of NPR, and we're paying for that now. Populism is not a good rebuttal to inquiry. It doesn't suffice. It might politically work, but it doesn't suffice. So I'm always at pains to go back. I'm just editing now a book for American Institute for Economic Research, which is an anthology of New Deal criticism. That is, people who got up during the New Deal, this period of the 1930s, they were in the minority. They were sometimes persecuted or prosecuted and complained about this or that and pointed out this or that about the New Deal, which was largely failing. They were disregarded. And what I tried to distill in the intro was they were disregarded because Roosevelt was a powerful president and a great inspiration, and they were disregarded because the Democratic Party built up quite a bunch of constituencies, Buchanan-wise, to win an election, particularly 36, which is a constituency-based election in the modern fashion. But the conservatives and the free marketeers screwed up in that they fought publicly with one another. So they were divided, and they favored the ad hominem. This person, they favored the racialist comment, they favored the ad hominem. Well, that disqualified them even then, let alone now, from serious consideration and made them unmemorable. If you get on TV and scream about someone, 5 years later, people who look at that recording won't even understand it and will just be uncomfortable associating himself with you as an attacker. So that is a real problem. So I tried to bring that out, how the New Deal critics failed to gain purchase, even though their argument was actually better. And I think there's some lessons to be learned there. They were speaking the truth.
Yeah. There's a lot of wisdom in what you just.
So this book is called New Deal Rebels. I'm going to give a plug for it. I like
New Deal Rebels.
New Deal Rebels, AIER, but it's an anthology of them, whatever they said, and they were really in the opposition. So if you feel like you're lonely and you're in the opposition, New Deal Rebels are good to read because they got nowhere. Roosevelt was elected 4 times.
So I wanted to ask you about the relationship of this book in relationship to 2 other books of yours. So you've written these actually quite detailed histories of 2 of the main movements towards big government, that is FDR and the New Deal, and then this book with LBJ and Nixon and the Great Society. But you also wrote about Calvin Coolidge, in which his attitudes towards government were not to lean towards big government. I'll tell you just a little story aside. I went to Grove City College as an undergrad. Wow. My teacher was Hans Senholz, and Ronald Reagan got elected, and Senholz was not completely on board with Ronald Reagan. He still thought Ronald Reagan was basically pushing for the state at some level. And he said in class, someone asked him, and they said, when was the last good president? And he said, Calvin Coolidge was the last good president in America. And so that was funny. But Coolidge doesn't look to the government to solve our social ills. Whereas in these others, the only solution to our social ills is going to be in government. And so what lessons did you get in your research and writing of understanding this transformation of attitudes, ideology, and in particular, I wanted to ask you about institutional strengths and weaknesses, because one of the strong thing about the constitutional perspective is that supposedly the Constitution doesn't just bend at the will of whatever who's in power, right? The Constitution is a binding constraint, which serves as, you know, these railings to keep the activity in. But yet there must have been some institutional weaknesses in which this growth of government ended up by exploiting in some sense. So I was just wondering if you had insights in this.
I mean, the progressive movement was on a roll before Coolidge.
Yeah.
I think there's great utility, frankly, in the GOP platform of 1920, when Coolidge was not the presidential candidate. He was the vice presidential candidate. It was Harding, for normalcy. They worked on that platform. Today, platform is sort of secondary to personality and character, which I'm worried about because nobody's perfect. But anyway, they had a very strong platform. And then they, of basically pulling government back in 1920. Harding Coolidge won. Harding made some good moves. In particular, he hired Andrew Mellon as Treasury Secretary, the greatest debt expert and Treasury Secretary that we had since Hamilton, to manage our overwhelming debt, but also the debt of the European nations for whom we were a creditor, right? Reschedule, change, you know, and also on tax policy, Harding passed a good budget law that made it much easier to get a hold of the budget and therefore balance it. And Coolidge came in when Harding died, and Coolidge basically said, I will execute on the contract with America that is the 1920 platform of the party. He didn't say, Harding died, he had some imperfections, they will emerge in Teapot Dome, the scandal of the era, which they did, and I will be different. And Calvin, he said, I will subordinate myself to the will of the electorate as expressed in the 1920 election, and I will fulfill this to perfection. And that humility that enabled him to clean up the reputation of the presidency. It made, by the way, the project more robust to scandal. The reason scandal is so fatal now is if we only believe in character, and then some president or other turns out to have extra children or what all, then what do we believe in? In those days, they believed in the platform, and men served the platform. Men came and went, men come and go, and they don't have to be perfect. They just have to be adequate, which is a better representation of humanity, right? So Coolidge comes in, and he actually does believe in not only, and this is important for economists to think about, not only the behavioralist, economic, numbers-based sort of argument for lower tax rates, which, you know, they laid out beautifully, what the early version of what we would call supply side economics, that lower rates can sometimes promote or permit more business activity, thereby generating more revenue than perhaps expected by the data points, but also that it was immoral to overtax people. Coolidge made the moral case always, and he believed that, from his background as a New England small town lawyer, and from his background in New England as a small town citizen whose father had to collect, I don't know, the school tax, the snow tax in his village. So he had a very great awareness of that experience. And his personality, his experience matched up with the agenda he was obligated to fulfill. But it was a sense of service. In terms of the wave or the great flood of progressivism, think of Coolidge as the boy with his finger in the dike. The progressives were there, the movement was growing, Wilson had been president, much was undone, but the waters were pressing on the wall the whole time. And when Coolidge was gone, and the economy turned, a bad economy is always an argument for government action. And what was disappointing was that Hoover, a Republican, did not continue in Coolidge fashion. So you want to imagine the great difference between them. Herbert Hoover was more like a Mitt Romney. He was a very bright guy, really impressive when you met him, great had achieved some amazing things in the private and public sectors, but all about him and his management skills. Whereas Coolidge was a delegator, a behind the scenes person, more like, in a way, President Eisenhower. Coolidge really made a religion of modesty. And that's not always attractive in a human being. It turns to sanctimony, but it was useful for the people. So setting aside all that, what is useful for anyone who's instructing or talking is the fact that the supply side experiment of the 20s did work. That is, the statistics of income from that period are a beautiful thing. There's plenty of money that comes in even as rates go lower. They fixed the capital gains rate. There had been a question of whether cap gains would be treated as ordinary income for tax purposes. That was pretty bad because the tap rate at the beginning of the Harding administration was, I think, 73%. Imagine a capital gains tax of 73. They fixed it at effectively 12.5. That was very important for growth in the 20s, for the great boom that we had. And the productivity numbers are equally compelling for that decade, as well as the patent numbers. All of them are worthy of more dissertations. We have insufficient sort of books about the 20s. But my Coolidge book is really just a story of the 20s and a battle with progressivism told through a character who happened to be there. That was Calvin Coolidge. I thought of calling the book The 20s, but Coolidge got interesting, so I told the same story through him.
Yeah. For the participants here, I just have one more question for Amity, and then I open it up. So please use the raise hand function to get on, and then you'll be able to ask Amity your question. You already mentioned the book about the New Deal, but is there any other books that you're working on at the moment? And I guess to put you on the spot, do you think that you'll ever eventually write a book about Build Back Better or the COVID experience or any of that?
I'll leave that to you, gentlemen and ladies, because I think writing about now, to tell the audience the truth, Pete and I have been talking about a book that's sort of basic, simple rules about the economy on the model of Henry Hazlitt. There are a lot of those. There's a nice one. And that book is necessary. So one book I am thinking of writing is a short history of the economy of the 20th century, because it is really just a story with heroes and demons about the admirable persistence of the private sector in the face of incursions from the government. Yeah. That's the history of the 20th century. And what the private sector gave us so much. And I don't think younger people are necessarily aware enough of that. And all of us are not aware enough of that. The book that is obsessing me is I'm writing a book about the period before World War I, from the Gilded Age on. I don't want to call it the Gilded Age, but I discovered this morning in research for that Mark Twain kind of didn't like Theodore Roosevelt. And I kind of don't like Theodore Roosevelt either. Why? He was way arbitrary. So imagine JP Morgan goes to Theodore Roosevelt, whose government is going to, wreck his Northern securities on antitrust grounds. Antitrust is very questionable doctrine, and you've all said that. And poor JP Morgan said, well, you're attacking my railroad. What are you going to attack all my other things? And TR said, not unless we think you might have done something wrong. That's a rotten answer. The answer should be not unless you broke this law, which is on the books, and a
Right.
clear law, which, by the way, of course, antitrust law is not, if you go back and look at the Sherman Act. So I'm basically doing a book about the first progressive wave, but through the people. And I didn't expect to have Mark Twain be a character, but he is. Mark Twain is really interesting because he basically was always taking snapshots of the age, including more of the economy than I had imagined, having only experienced him sort of as, Huck Finn, and that's about it, right? But I'm looking for a good title for it. I don't want to do Gilded Age because that's their pejorative for the period. And I will say, if you're working in this area, one book that hasn't got enough credit has been Bert Folsom's Myth of the Robber Barons, where he discerns between just rent seekers who grab something, say the part of the river where you could have the ferry boat land, and monopolize it. That is monopolizing assets instead of outright innovation, like Thomas Edison. And Bert long ago went through, and that book is a good book to teach about the period. But so this book will be about progressivism and its opponents, and it even has Henry George in it, which I never imagined. And there's a fascination today with Henry George. And the reason it matters is because many of the impulses of that period, antitrust, minimum wage, kind of a real hankering to redistribute more. The first time America saw that effectively was in this period, about 1880 to 1910.
Yeah.
1914.
Well, I really look forward to reading that and learning from that. We have so Amy has her hand up first, and then we have a group of people here that we'll get to. So and Amity, the way we do this is Amy will ask her question, you respond just to her, then we go to the next person and go like that. All right, Amy.
Good news. I'm not going to ask a question. I'm going to make a plea so we can get right to Robert after me. Amity, I'm excited about the Gilded Age, soon to be retitled book, but I'd like to make a plea for you to write that history of education in America. The last good one that exists, I know some of you are going to agree with me, and I see you now. The last good one I think that we have is Left Back by Diane Ravitch, and she of course has gone crazy. So it would be really nice to have a good book on how that sort of all evolved from someone who's
my book would be basically would march through the decades. Would that be okay, Amy? Okay, and and the main point too is getting back to what Pete said is the people in the early 60s started like this. They said, given a strong economy, we will. What if there isn't a strong economy? What if it isn't a given? And that's very similar to now. The planners at the White House think that a strong economy is a birthright and it's always there. It isn't. So that I think we were lucky to have as much of the gift as we got, and we have to sustain it. Okay, go on. Sorry. Thank you, Amy.
Robert.
Hi, thanks for everything. Just before my question, I want to say if anyone's interested in antitrust law and is looking for a non-super technical entryway, there are a couple of books about antitrust in baseball that you can learn about some antitrust background, some court cases, while hearing about the New York Yankees and the Baltimore Orioles and the history of baseball. I recommend it. And for my question.
And what are those? Oh, that's great. Will you send me those?
Sure. I'll put the titles in the chat. They're great. As for my question, I'm wondering, if I listen to people talk today about stagflation or about the kind of the change from the Great Society era to kind of, we'll say, the Reagan era and Reagan's politics and economics, it always seems to skip over like the 70s and stagflation. It seems to go, Great Society was going great, things were fantastic, and then ... Reagan came along, we got Milton Friedman, we've got Reaganomics, and now we've got neoliberalism. And why did we get rid of the Great Society, or why did we move past this? In my mind, I'm thinking, well, we had stagflation, the kind of the dominant Keynesian paradigm seemed to have a hard time answering that. At least there's something that happened. So did you come across anything contemporaneous in the 70s when stagflation was really hitting? And I guess Milton Friedman's point of view was kind of ascendant. The Keynesian paradigm was descendant. Did anyone kind of like have a response to this at the time? Did they throw their hands up? Did they also kind of say, why are we changing things? Everything is going fine. Something along that line.
Well, anyone who so there was a division among the monetarists, between the monetarists and the more, I would say, traditional, I mean, pre-war style economists, and also the Austrian school, which was unpleasant and probably unnecessary, right? So, but anyone who spoke up in the 70s was regarded as insane. That's sort of the problem. And then the economy was so poor that suddenly those people were less insane, you know, sort of like they were regarded in a kind of the Ayn Rand category. Well, Ayn Rand told a lot of truth. And she, you know, when you see, so I'm trying to think, a lot of the economists we admired were trained in the 70s. So you have to say that in econ at places like Chicago, there were refuges. I mean, when Milton Friedman became famous, he already had tenure. Do you think Milton would get tenure at Chicago today? I'm not sure. I'm not sure. He might get tenure, but you know, even Chicago isn't where it was. And certainly Stanford. So the people we know who have tenure, that doesn't mean that people who are like them a generation and a half later will get tenure. Milton had a refuge. He had a fine job at the university, so he could say what he liked. He also had, there wasn't, Newsweek had a history of staging free market economists. It was Newsweek that staged Henry Hazlitt, Economics in One Lesson. And when Henry had done this job for quite a long time, then Milton and someone else was hired. And Newsweek doesn't do that anymore. The platforms are not being supplied. So that's quite a problem. I mean, you can think of all the professors you admire doing their work in the 70s that then emerged in the 80s, at sometimes even as policy. Kahn, late 70s. Think of Jimmy Carter was so desperate that sometimes he turned to conservatives like Paul Volcker, you know. So I hope I've begun to answer. It was a very down period. If you grew up in it, you remember that. My mother paid my college tuition with a credit card. It was terrifying.
One of the things I really like about your book is the interaction between the policy intentions and then the frustration with the policy realizations of not actually coming through, right? Which is, you know, and so I think that, you know, one of the things that's missing in Robert's question is the, you know, the impact that, say, a book like Losing Ground had, which was primarily all empirical, but it was basically showing that all these programs that had these high expectations ended up by not living up to those expectations. And therefore that required us, reality sort of smacked us in the face. So it required us to have to rethink things. So
the reality was too brutal, and maybe it was too brutal to ignore.
Yeah.
And the economy fell behind. So that was evident to people. You know, when interest rates are 15%, that means you buy a house with 1.5 fewer bedrooms, or 2, right? Well, that people noticed that, and they were even well in, you know, mid 80s mortgages. So hopefully we don't have to go through an experience like that.
Yeah, Victoria.
Hi, Amity. It's such a pleasure that you can join us. I just am thrilled with this book club because we get to talk to super smart people. But my question is about time and time framings. You know, as a historian, you look at decades. It's so clear from your book that the sensitivity to generational differences between the actors and their views. In policy today and issue framing today, it's so snapshot in time. It's like, here's some data, here's a problem, you know, smash it together. and have good intentions that it'll all work out. And I'm just wondering, having studied, a century worth of policy and expectations, do you see anywhere where, vectors of time are used methodology to frame issues better and to say, we can't expect this to happen in one generation, or we should expect a response from this in, 2 business cycles. But it just seems that there's just so many mismatches between resource allocation and expectations and those types of things. So sorry, I ran on there.
Oh, yes. Well, I think negative campaigning is all about time. You want to win this election, so you trash your opponent in the hopes that come November, the voter will still be angry and support you. But there's no policy behind that. Coolidge never trashed his opponent. He said you were squandering time to make the case for your policy. And if you hadn't made your case for policy before the election, then how would you get support for it, even if you won after the election? So yeah, I'm worried about that, but I do think there'll be countering movements. I do think religious faith may, if there were a way to bet on baby names, put it this way, and make money. And if any of you knows that, predicting popularity of future baby names, I would predict that the baby name Mary will be #1 again, because I do believe that Americans will turn to faith. Not all of us can go with them in this specific, whichever specific denomination or movement they're in, but I think they will. And faith asks people, patience of people, and it works in longer time frames. I'm not saying I recommend that. I'm just sort of in my small way predicting that. But you're right, and that is the great concern. People always say, can someone like Coolidge be elected again? Well, Margaret Thatcher was elected, but there had to be a lot of trouble in the UK first. So someone like Coolidge could be elected, but probably after a bit of trouble.
Taylor?
Hi, Amity. Really enjoyed your book on the Great Depression and this one, and looking forward to reading Coolidge. I just want to second and third Amy's suggestion about a book on education.
On what?
On education.
But I said I would write a book of economic history of the 20th century, and Amy said write a book about education. Is that right?
Yep.
So.
Well, I've got a question too. I just wanted to say that, my wife, I started school in the 50s. So did my wife. She teaches middle school now. And it's a nightly conversation about all the things that kids don't learn, these things that we learned when we were kids. And I agree with you that unless that changes, we're not going to be able to make the kind of changes that we talk about. Getting back to a little bit of government. I'm going to cheat and have a 2-part question. One, the subtitle of the book is A New History. Was there an old history that you were trying particularly to challenge or dispel when you wrote this book? And second part, Pete talked about the courage of defending your convictions. What did you feel like were the challenges you faced when you wrote this book, the challenges to your facts, your ideas, or whatever, to the book?
Oh, thank you for asking that. Yeah, Pete's point about it's not the argument, it's the critiques of your argument that bedevil you is so real. It's a new history because old histories tend to glorify the Great Society in the same style that they glorify the New Deal. Not everything was right, but they meant well. It's basically that. Added to that, not everything. My point was they meant well, but they actually wrought disaster, and we can't look away from the period in the name of not hurting the figures in it because of the extent of the damage they wrought. There's a good book right here by John Cogan called The High Cost of Good Intentions. It's a history of entitlements. He didn't get enough play for that book. Here it is. High Cost of Good, is it backward? High Cost of Good Intentions, John Cogan, Hoover. It's fantastic. All the history of entitlements all the way. And that book has not been taught or taken up enough. And I actually relied a lot on Cogan and actually Chairman Greenspan's office with my data. So thank them. But the function in particular, there's a case called Goldberg v. Kelly, which essentially said welfare is more your own property. It defined the modern entitlement. You're actually entitled to this money. And I wrote about that. The true story of the Great Society is that it hurt all of us, including African Americans, not the civil rights parts, but the welfare state part. And we just all have to point that out. And they're African Americans who point it out. But that's kind of the high stakes area of it. Which is sad, which is sad that the stakes are so high to saying the truth. And that was a bit rough. I think it's also a bit rough to write about an area people remember, because of course they have specific memories and they come back at you. Wait a minute, it wasn't quite like that, in the inflation year of 1972 or so on. One wants to be able to woo the reader into suspending disbelief and tell basically a story with accurate facts, but still a story. And that's harder to do the more proximate the period you're discussing is. So I guess I like to talk about the past, not to be inaccurate, but because people are more in fairy tale mode when you talk with them about the past.
Okay, Kevin.
Yes, hello. Actually, one quick side note before I get to my question. You did say you had a prediction about a revival of religious faith. I did notice in my newsfeed the other day a story that popped up about the surprising resurgence of religious faith amongst the youth of today's generation. So, single data point, but that seems like it could be something that could be indicative of what you were predicting. That aside, my question. One of the things I actually liked, or I thought was very appropriate about your book, was you start off with a sort of summation of the New Deal as failing to achieve what it set out to achieve. It is pretty striking that the economic downturn in this country that the government took greater steps to intervene in and try to alleviate is also the economic downturn that lasted the longest, that took the most time to recover from. That seems like it should be a pretty striking fact on its own. And then at the end of the book, in the appendix, you have a series of graphs, including one showing the poverty rate and how it had been trending down for decades. And then basically once the Great Society program started, it flatlines and it's basically held level for the decades since then. So my question is, I think amongst people generally, it's taken as almost axiomatic that the New Deal was critical for recovery from the Great Depression, and that Great Society programs are critical for keeping poverty at bay, despite the fact that those programs going into effect also correlates with the decline in the poverty rate, basically stopping in its tracks and holding fast for decades. So given the fact that there is just a very big and stark disconnect between what was advertised is going to come as a result of these programs and what the actual results will be, why is it that the perception of these giant programs, Great Deal, New Deal, or Great Society, continues to be so positive?
Oh, just romanticism, political aspiration, idealism. And, but things do break through. I really am looking at Mark Twain, and, Mark Twain was not considered literature. He was considered tacky by book editors and by the magazines. And yet he changed the country. Huck Finn was like To Kill a Mockingbird, right? In terms of its effect over race, because Huck says, and those of you who know more about Mark Twain, I may have it wrong, but I never read Huckleberry Finn that way, really. I never even read it practically. Huck Finn says, well, I'm not going to turn this runaway slave back to his master, and I may go to hell for it. That's the culture of the South, but then I'll go to hell. I mean, often, my point being, or you think of Ayn Rand, often enlightenment comes from outside the establishment through the mode of fiction or through a movie, or so I think realization has to come that way, because our universities aren't always able to provide it, though we try to make them do so. provide the alternate view. So you look to the culture. Milton Friedman got some support from the free to choose people, from I think it was Mr. Chittister in the day, and so on, who made that movie. I'm not sure he would have ever penetrated if he hadn't had a TV series, and if PBS, by the miracle that it was, hadn't picked it up, right? So I believe there's hope. People suspect that they're wrong already. One just has to figure out an artistic or communications way to get to them. I don't think yelling at people helps. That's the problem that we have with talk radio and Fox. As much as I like them in many ways, or many things they've achieved, they yell at people.
Yeah.
And that's not good. At Coolidge, so does that answer your question? I don't know.
Yes, it does. Thank you. And I definitely like the point about not yelling at people, because one of the things we can't help but notice that Milton Friedman was very successful in what he did, and he was just unfailingly polite. You see him giving speeches at college campuses and receiving hostile questions and just returning with the friendliest demeanor possible while still directly engaging with ideas. I think that there's, aside from just being, I think, a more pleasant way to be for yourself, it's also a much better way to engage with other people.
And I also think on the conservative or free market side, we have to be very aware of tribalism. If we are, or they, at a school, a teacher, you're either with him or against him, which happens at small concentrated free market or conservative schools, that's not good. But we have to be willing to discuss all ways and not shut people out because they're not our particular brand of economist or historian. And you see that, we always have to be aware of that. We want to be better than political progressive history departments or econ departments, politically progressive. We want to be more open than they are and more playful, because economics is never going to make discoveries if it doesn't play. And one of the things I admire about Pete is he's willing to do that. Economics is fooling around to discover something interesting but it's not doctrine. That's the great thing about it. It's discovery. So we have to keep that sense of play. That's one thing, I very much like Daniel Patrick Moynihan, because he knew he was wrong. And once in a while in the book, he admits it.
Yeah.
He had a guaranteed income program, and there were some experiments they ran, I think, in New Jersey. And then he wrote in National Review, boy, were we wrong. Guaranteed income does not promote employment. On the contrary, people stay home when they get a payment. Sort of like, I think, what, or get in trouble, as per, I think Casey Mulligan's been writing some papers about that. So that freedom to admit you were wrong, that's gone because we're all so tense about losing any say at all that we're very tight, and that's a real loss in our discussion.
Mark?
Amity, loved The Forgotten Man, loved your presentation at Acton University last year on the Great Society. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
The Port Huron part, Roosevelt's Four Freedoms. And at the end, the statement you have that there were three statements, but the statement on freedom of religion was not included because the guy fell asleep. Now, tell me the story behind that. And if he wouldn't have fallen asleep, would it have any impact?
This was a bunch of kids in an altered state of some kind, maybe just alcohol, but anyway, altered state of some kind, writing utopian documents. I think it's telling that they left religion out. And of course, isn't just that someone fell asleep, but I don't know what to say. The four freedoms, I think one of them is freedom from want, right?
Right.
freedom from one is hard to deliver. And
Right.
this camp happened to be, it's ironic, this camp happened to be as per poverty, right? The poverty data.
Poverty, yeah.
Yeah, so this camp was an FDR inspired camp. I think it was called Camp for Freedoms at the time. I'm remembering now. It's a while since I wrote the book, a few years. So these kids were, some of them were very no longer kids, weren't quite aware of all the ironies and contexts. I'm waiting for someone to do a dissertation on this because I got into Port Huron somewhat and discovered the union subsidy, but there's more to do. There's more to do on it. And there's certainly more to do on the UAW. There's more to do on Robert Kennedy, who is quite destructive in my view, and the changes in US law. There's a lot more to do on NPR. And, but I also liked all the dissertations Pete came up with. We didn't talk about this sort of anti-baby movement, the scarcity craze that came over in the 70s, and that's in the book too.
Right.
The scarcity craze, you know, Julian Simon debating Paul Ehrlich and all that. Paul Ehrlich argued for a diaper tax in order to discourage reproduction. This sort of Malthusian moment.
Yeah.
I was looking at that. I was just like, wow. But thank you guys for being interested in the book. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate praise from Pete, one of my heroes. So even if we're the same age.
I was just gonna say, Amity, that there's and related to that, Naomi Arekis, who just wrote this book called The Big Myth. It's a attack on free market ideas and whatnot. But she also had an article, I think it might have been in Nature or Science, in which she said 8 billion people is not an achievement, it's a catastrophe. So the same kind of ideas that Ehrlich had are still with us. And the Julian Simon kind of arguments need to really be out there more and more and more. You know, and it's shocking to me how impervious to evidence people are. That was one of the things what you brought up about Daniel Patrick Moynihan. There's two things about that story in your book, because you have him as the pinnacle of the professional planner, right? I mean, he is scientism like writ large in the beginning of the book, right? He's going to bring scientific management to policy and all this stuff. And it's about measurement. He wants to have measurement and everything. And then you have him also, you know, being this guy who's willing to work with Nixon, right, to get the job done because he cares so much about, you know, working for government, not for a president, but working for government to do good things. But yet he also learns from the refractory reality when it hits him, which is very, you know, it's a very positive characteristic, I think. And so he
very likable man, and many love him.
Yeah.
He was associated with an awful lot of trouble, starting with, I would just close by saying, public sector unions, the executive order that JFK signed, kind of without even paying attention to it, I think, which related to federal employees, but established a culture that public sector unions could be strong, and that the government smiled on that. And that was rather destructive for us. And then also Moynihan wrote an architecture directive about federal buildings, which honored too much modern architects and led to things like the HUD building, right, or other brutalist buildings we have, which I feel personally are anti-individual. Yeah. And then on top of that, various guaranteed income ideas, but he is kind of lovable. Moynihan, kind of lovable. So there they all are to learn about. If you have any suggestions, let me know in terms of reaching younger people. I take your point. I've written it down, Amy, about writing a book about education.
Well, I think that you have a lot of wisdom in what you said about the observation of listening to NPR versus Fox and how different that comes to people. And so rather than angrynomics, we have
Right.
actual rational discussion about things, and how do we cultivate that conversation among our students, I think is really important.
And the students have to, for their part, be brave and tell the politicians that they want that, because the politicians just talk to a bunch of media advisors who create the most heinous cartoon commercials for them. They
Right.
trash themselves in these commercials. And this is a problem the GOP has. It's a problem the Democrats have, and maybe we need a new party. So there you are. But I'm glad that Pete exists. I'm glad that Liberty Fund exists, and all of you exist. And there more can be achieved.
Well, thank you very much, Amity. This has been fantastic, and we appreciate greatly your time.
Yes,
Oh, thank
you.
you.
I promise.
Write me a note, Amy.
I promise when it comes out, I will give a copy to all the teachers I know and work with. So, so there you go. Thank you very much, friends, for joining us today. What a fabulous discussion. Thank you, Pete, for another great selection. Thanks to all of you for taking time out of your day to join us. We will capture all of the links that have been coming through, the links and the comments coming through in the chat section, and we will post those in the portal as well as the video when we have it ready. So thanks, everyone, and have a terrific day.